There it is now. Fortunately, I caught it myself this time. I wish I caught it before we started, though. But so every week I have to do this, and it's a new thing that I'm having to do. My soundboard is, I've got two computers that I'm running under the desk, and my soundboard has only one USB port. And when I'm recording music, I have to unplug it from the studio computer into the other computer, and then it stays plugged in that way most of the week. And then, but every time I disconnect it to plug it into another one, even if I plug it back in, it resets the audio to where you have to actually tell it to use that wire again every week. And it's a new thing that I've got to. I need to start remembering. Maybe put a note, a little post-it on the front of the computer. We're all loud and clear now. So Galatians chapter 2, did Christ die in vain? And yeah, that's where we're headed.
Okay.
It's good to have you back, Rabbi.
Stay tuned. Good to be back.
Very good.
So
very good.
This is actually, it could be a very complicated chapter that we're going to be looking at. And it begins where Paul speaks about a gap of about 14 years since he's been to Jerusalem. And he writes here that he, is going to be going up to Jerusalem, he says, because there was a revelation that he received. Now, if we go to the parallel passage of Galatians chapter 2, it's basically Acts chapter 15. And in Acts 15, it sort of sets the stage for what we're going to be facing tonight, because it says there that certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So that's how Acts chapter 15 starts off, that there were people coming from Judea, which is where Jerusalem was, and they were teaching the people that I guess Paul is with, that there's a need for everybody to be circumcised, not just the Jewish people that were following Jesus, but even the non-Jewish converts. So Paul says here in Galatians that because of this, he had to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this issue. And he says he went up because of a revelation, that there was some kind of a revelation that basically sent him on this mission. But in the book of Acts, in chapter 15 in the book of Acts, it has a different reason for going. It basically says there that the church in Antioch, which was where he was, delegated him and Barnabas to represent them in Jerusalem to discuss this issue. So we have really basically two ways in which this story is presented. One is Paul's version here in Galatians, which is that he was inspired by revelation to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this issue of, do non-Jews really have to get circumcised and essentially follow all the laws of the Torah? Or the way Luke presents the story in the book of Acts, which is that, no, he was basically sent there, not by revelation, but by the leaders of the church in Antioch who said, this issue needs to be discussed. And Paul says here in Galatians, I went up because of revelation, and I set before them, meaning he went before them, the people in Jerusalem, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. He presented his understanding of what is the message to the Gentiles in order to make sure, he says, that I was not running or had not run in vain. Meaning Paul in Galatians is very concerned. He seems to be very concerned that the future of the whole movement is really at risk here, as we'll see tonight, why he was so concerned. And so he really goes to Jerusalem to hammer out this issue. What is going to be imposed upon people that are not Jewish, that are coming into this movement, into this Jesus movement? And again, there were people that were advocating that they had to get circumcised and follow all the laws of the Torah, essentially convert to Judaism. And Paul, who obviously took a very different track, different point of view, And he writes here in verse 3, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was Greek. So here, basically, Paul is giving you the final outcome of this whole story. That here is the test case. Here, Paul is bringing someone who is not Jewish, Titus, with him, and Titus was not forced to be circumcised. So basically, that's the discussion. That's really the conclusion of the discussion, as we're going to see. Now, it's interesting that Titus was not circumcised by Paul, certainly, because Paul didn't believe that non-Jews had to be circumcised. But we know from the 16th chapter of Acts, Acts chapter 16, that Paul circumcised Timothy. Now, it's interesting, Timothy was someone who was basically half Jewish. We're told that he had a Jewish mother, but a non-Jewish father. This, by the way, is an interesting proof from the Christian Bible of the Jewish law of matrilineal descent, meaning that you see from this story in Acts chapter 16 that a person's status, whether they were Jewish or not Jewish, was based upon the mother, not upon the father. So basically what you see in Acts chapter 16 is Paul circumcising Timothy, who basically was halachically Jewish. He was considered Jewish according to Jewish law because his mother was Jewish. What's interesting is that in the book of Acts, and this is just important to bear in mind for our discussion tonight, in the book of Acts here in chapter 16, it doesn't say that Paul circumcised Timothy because it was a biblical commandment. That's why you would think he would have a Jew circumcised. But it says in Acts chapter 16 there that he circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region. Meaning that it wasn't that he really felt there was an absolute obligation to even circumcise a Jew, to even circumcise Timothy, who was Jewish, because there was a biblical commandment to do so. He did it because it was really politically expedient. And it's interesting that we see this throughout Paul's writings. You know, this is one thing that we've tried to pay attention to in our sessions. You know, what was Paul's view of Torah observance? And some people try to make the distinction that, well, he certainly did not believe Gentiles needed to begin observing the laws of the Torah. They were never obligated to in the first place. So they don't have to. They don't have to convert to Judaism. But the real question is, what did Paul feel about Jews observing the Torah? Was it necessary for Jews to observe the Torah after the advent of Jesus? And so we see here in Acts chapter 16 that he doesn't circumcise Timothy because he feels it's a biblical necessity, a commandment from God to circumcise Jews, but rather because of the Jews who were in that region, meaning he would have had a difficult time in his missionary work if his cohort was not circumcised. And we saw previously when we did the book of Romans, back in Romans chapters 14 and 15, where it says that Paul allowed Jews who were attached to the Torah, meaning that Paul knew he was dealing with Jewish people that had embraced Jesus, that had been raised as Torah observant. And so what we saw in his writings to the Romans in chapters 14 and 15, that he was okay with Jews that were attached to the Torah to keep on observing the Torah if their faith was weak, meaning that, again, it wasn't for Paul a real absolute biblical necessity, meaning that Paul realized that if this was something people were used to doing and their faith was weak, meaning their faith in the gospel was weak, and felt that if they stopped circumcising or stopped observing any of the other laws, it would violate their conscience. So in order not to sort of disturb people's consciences, Paul felt it was okay for them to keep on observing the Torah. And I found the same exact approach in Martin Luther's commentary to Galatians here in chapter 2. Martin Luther writes the following. He says, custom has such force, meaning that what people have always been doing has such force that the Jews who were newly converted to Christianity could not suddenly abandon the Torah. They couldn't stop observing the law. They had received the Christian faith, but thought that it was necessary to observe the Torah even so, meaning even though they had accepted Jesus as their Savior, they still felt that it was necessary to observe the Torah. And so Martin Luther says that God bore with their weakness for a time until the doctrine of the gospel was plainly distinguished from the Torah. So you see that according to Martin Luther's understanding of the Christian scriptures, the Torah is no longer incumbent even upon the Jews to observe. And I think that we see the same kind of attitude from Paul as well. So basically, what happens here in Galatians chapter 2 is that Paul writes that there were these, he calls them false brothers, that sort of slipped into their group in Antioch. And they wanted to, he says in verse 4 here, they wanted to spy out our freedom that we have in the Messiah Jesus so that we might bring us, so that they might bring us into slavery. From Paul's point of view, the need to observe the Torah and the commandments of the Torah he refers to as slavery. But he writes in verse 5 that we did not yield in submission even for a moment, meaning Paul says that these people who insisted that the Gentiles get circumcised, Paul said not going to happen, and we did not allow that to happen. And then he says in verse 6, and from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me, Paul says. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. Now, we have to understand what he's saying here in verse 6. He's writing about his trip to Jerusalem, and he's writing about those who seemed to be influential. He's really writing here about what he calls later on in this chapter the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, meaning the leaders of the movement, people like Peter and James and John. And he speaks about them here. I think it sounds pretty snarky to me, the way Paul refers to the leaders in Jerusalem. I'll read this verse again. He says, and from those who seem to be influential, and he writes in parentheses here, what they were makes no difference to me because God shows no partiality. He says, those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me, meaning that they didn't really have anything to teach me. They didn't really have anything that I didn't know or that I needed. I mean, he basically is very dismissive of these leaders in Jerusalem. Now, we know that the leaders in Jerusalem were, as far as they were concerned, Paul had at least two strikes going against him. Number one, the apostles and the leaders of the movement in Jerusalem, they knew that Jesus had commissioned them. They were with Jesus. They were students of Jesus. They were confidants of Jesus. And they knew that Jesus had commissioned them to be apostles, to be leaders. But when it came to Paul just simply is making a claim, as we've discussed many times in the past. Paul simply claims that Jesus appointed him as an apostle. And they're forced to take Paul at his word. And I'm sure that wasn't easy for them to do because of his prior actions towards their movement, meaning that they knew of Paul as a persecutor, as an opponent. And now all of a sudden Paul is claiming that Jesus appointed him an apostle. I'm sure that didn't go down easily. And Paul probably always had this lack of credibility. And secondly, as we know from the book of Acts, the movement in Jerusalem were constantly getting reports about Paul, that Paul's view was that the Torah was no longer required for even the Jews. Meaning we see that in Acts 21, verse 21, where Paul's accused. They say that, Paul, we hear that you're teaching even the Jews who are in the diaspora that they don't need to circumcise their children or to observe the laws or the customs. So we see that it wasn't simply Paul making a distinction between Jews and Gentiles in terms of Torah observance. It seems that there was a lot of suspicion about Paul's attitude about the need to observe the Torah even for Jews. And I think because of those two reasons, the group in Jerusalem probably never felt entirely comfortable with Paul. Now, in verse 7, Paul says, on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, so Paul basically says here that as far as he was concerned, the leaders of the group in Jerusalem, they realized that Paul had been given this task of being the major apostle to the Gentiles, and what he calls to the uncircumcised. And, this is basically contradicted by what we saw in the book of Acts, meaning here in Galatians chapter 2, Paul simply claims, it's a direct claim he makes, that the leaders in Jerusalem accepted his claim that Jesus appointed him to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And we know that in the book of Acts, chapter 15, when it discusses this whole question, there was the council, really the first major church council to discuss this question about what is going to happen with the Gentiles that are being converted by Paul. Are they obligated to get circumcised and observe the commandments of the Torah or not so? And that became the subject of discussion in Acts chapter 15. Now, had the leaders in Jerusalem really accepted Paul's claim that Jesus appointed him as the apostle to the Gentiles, what they should have said at that point in Acts chapter 15 was, well, Paul, you're the man that's in charge of this department. What did Jesus reveal to you? Meaning that if you were really appointed by Jesus as the person in charge of witnessing to the Gentiles and to ministering to the Gentiles, what did Jesus tell you they need to do? Did Jesus require they get circumcised? Did Jesus tell you that they absolutely don't have to keep the Torah laws and get circumcised? What we see, though, in Acts chapter 15 is that they didn't defer to Paul. They didn't defer to him. And what happens in Acts chapter 15 is that there's a discussion, and finally the ruling is made by James. James was the brother of Jesus who was actually the leader of the Jerusalem group up until his death about 30 years later. So again, what we see here is a contradiction between Paul's reporting in Acts chapter 2, where he just asserts that the group in Jerusalem accepted that he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and yet in Acts chapter 15, they don't act like that, meaning they don't give him deference and let him decide, or even ask him, what was Jesus' revelation to you? So as we go on in this chapter, Paul says that when James and Peter and John, who again, he sort of knocks them here, he says, and who seemed to be pillars, he never really gives them honor or respect. He says these are the three leaders of the Jesus movement in Jerusalem, and he just says they seemed to be pillars. They say that Paul here again reports that they saw that grace was given to me, Paul says, and they gave me the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the Jews. So again, this seems to be Paul's version of the story. Paul is reporting here in a very, I think, possibly self-serving way. but it may not have been the case, meaning that it's quite possible that the group in Jerusalem was not so conciliatory to him, and they didn't simply accept him sight unseen just because he's claiming that Jesus spoke to him. Again, that's the picture that Paul wants us to believe, that the Jerusalem church gave him carte blanche, and they accepted him as the man in charge of the Gentiles. I'm not so sure that was the case. But Paul says something interesting here. Another problem, again, when we compare this chapter in Galatians to Acts chapter 15, Paul says that after they accepted us with the right hand of fellowship, he says that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing that I was eager to do. So what Paul reports here in Galatians chapter 2 is that when he went up to Jerusalem, they seemed to, again, this is a summary now, they seemed to totally accept the fact that Titus was not circumcised. So there was basically the conclusion was that non-Jews do not need to get circumcised and observe the laws of the Torah. And Paul says here that they gave him they accepted his claim that he was the apostle to the Gentiles. And the only thing they really asked of me, Paul says, was that when I go back to the diaspora to take up a collection for the poor believers in Jerusalem. But what Paul doesn't mention here, and this is a very significant omission, is he doesn't mention that when James decided in Acts chapter 15 that Gentiles do not need to get circumcised or to observe all the laws of the Torah, but James had a caveat in chapter 15 of Acts. There, what James says is, but we will teach the Gentiles that they have to abstain from things polluted by idols. They have to abstain from sexual immorality. They have to abstain from things strangled and from blood. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that these look very much like 4 of the 7 Noahide laws. And that would make a lot of sense, meaning if the decision of James and the Jerusalem Council is that, look, when Gentiles come into the movement, we're not going to demand that they convert to Judaism and follow the 613 laws of the Torah, but Judaism always believed that non-Jews were required to observe the 7 Noahide laws. And so it would make perfect sense for James to say, look, they don't need to convert to Judaism, but they have to be careful to observe the Noahide laws. And instead of listing all 7 of them, he lists what seems to be 4. So, for example, when he says to abstain from things polluted by idols, that would be the Noahide prohibition against idolatry. Then he says they have to abstain from sexual immorality. That's the Noahide prohibition of what we call Gilu Arayos, which is basically sexual immorality. And he says from things strangled. So that seems to be a dietary regulation, which may correspond to the prohibition against eating the limb of a living creature. Because we know that according to the Noahide laws, the animal has to be slaughtered before it is consumed. And I don't think that strangling was considered to be a legitimate way of slaughtering the animal. So it could be that this is a reference to the prohibition of against eating the limb of a living creature, and the prohibition against blood could easily be a shorthand for what in Hebrew is called shvichas damim, spilling of blood, which is the term in Hebrew for murder, which would again be another of the 7 Noahide laws. So instead of listing all 7, he sort of gives a shorthand and lists 4 of the 7. But basically what James seems to be saying is that, look, the Gentiles that you, Paul, are going to convert don't need to convert to Judaism. They need to observe just those laws that were always incumbent upon Gentiles. So that's the first half of this chapter, which is basically sort of going through the what took place in the 15th chapter of Acts, but I think with some very serious differences in the way Paul presents it from the way Luke presented it in the book of Acts. Now, the second half of the chapter is this encounter that Paul has when Peter comes to Antioch. And he describes the fact that he basically came up against Peter, and he was very upset with Peter. Why is that? Because he says that Peter originally was someone who would be very comfortable fellowshipping with Gentiles, meaning that he would be very comfortable eating at the same table with non-Jews. He doesn't say at the same table, but that's what it seems to imply, or maybe at different tables in the same room. I don't know if they would have that kind of separation between Jewish and Gentile believers. I would imagine that, he would eat at the same table with non-Jews. And what happened is at some point, Paul says here, that certain men, this is verse 12, before certain men came from James, so there were certain people who were emissaries of James, this is what Peter was doing. He was eating with the Gentiles. But apparently after these people came from James, Peter drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party, meaning he was fearful of those people who had been advocating for a maximum Torah observance by the Gentiles. Now, this is problematic because we know that James did not advocate that Gentiles had to be circumcised. So there is a lot of confusion here in terms of who the characters are. Are these people that simply claim to be speaking on behalf of James? Are they people who really were sent by James, but they distorted his message? It's very unclear because, again, James, we know from the book of Acts, did not require that Gentiles be circumcised. In any event, the real question is this. Here you have Peter as someone who had previously been comfortable eating with Gentile believers in Jesus. And now there are people coming from James, and because they said something, and it doesn't say here what these people said. We never told what these representatives of James said. But they said something, and Peter now refuses to eat with these Gentiles. And Paul feels this is a disaster. Paul feels that what this is going to do is to basically divide the Jesus movement into a Jewish Jesus movement and a Gentile Jesus movement. And Paul's probably more afraid that it's going to basically upend his entire version of the gospel, meaning Paul's entire version of the gospel, as we're going to see in this chapter, is that people are saved by grace alone, by faith in Jesus alone. And there's nothing that is accomplished, Paul feels, by observing the Torah. Now, again, what many people assume is that Paul's only gripe was with imposing the Torah upon Gentiles, which he certainly did. But I think he went much further. I think that he maybe didn't forbid Jews from observing the commandments. As we saw before, he probably felt it was like fighting City Hall. But it's pretty clear he didn't believe himself that it was necessary. And he would only do it because it was expedient. As he said we saw in Corinthians, where he said to the Jews, I became a Jew so I might win the Jews, meaning he did what he thought was expedient and what he thought was practical. And so again, he said that he circumcised Timothy, not because he felt there was a religious obligation, but because of the Jews, what they would say if Timothy wasn't circumcised. So Paul has his vision of the gospel, which is basically that Jesus died for your sins and you're saved through faith in Jesus, and observing the Torah is simply not important. And he feared that if Peter here, by pulling away from fellowshipping with the Gentiles, was going to create the impression that no, it is important to follow the laws of Judaism, and that may end up dragging everyone into that belief, And it may even convince the Gentiles that they too are required to observe the Torah laws. And Paul felt that this was going to basically sabotage and torpedo his entire gospel message. Now, when it comes to understanding this whole story, of Peter eating with the Gentile believers, it's interesting that there are many ways in which it's seen. Some of the let's say more Protestant commentaries to the book of Galatians, like John MacArthur, he feels that Peter himself had basically given up observing the dietary laws. That as far as he was concerned, Peter had a vision in Acts chapter 10, where Peter had a revelation that he no longer needed to observe the laws of keeping kosher. And so as far as many Christian commentaries to this chapter go, Peter was someone who simply was not just eating with these non-Jewish believers, he was eating their food. He was maybe even eating pork, that he just basically had given up the dietary laws. And now all of a sudden, because of peer pressure and fear of the more, let's say, Torah observant Messianic Jews, the more observant Jewish followers of Jesus, Peter was becoming more conservative, and he was not going to be eating anymore with these Gentile believers. Now, the way David Stern, who's a well-known Messianic Jew in Israel, who wrote a commentary to the Christian Bible, so the way David Stern understands this chapter, look, as a Messianic Jew, he's not interested in having Peter as someone who gave up observing the dietary laws. As a matter of fact, David Stern and many other people explain that in Acts chapter 10, the whole point of that chapter in Acts 10 was not to tell Peter that he could start eating pork, right? If you remember from that chapter, Peter had a vision where he saw this sheet coming down from heaven, and on the sheet were all these different non-kosher animals, and he hears a voice saying, "Kill and eat, kill and eat." And, many commentaries to that chapter point out that if Jesus himself had abrogated the law, if Jesus himself had basically said there's no need any longer to keep kosher, as many people assume he taught in Mark chapter 7, if Jesus really did abrogate the Torah laws of the dietary laws, why would Peter need a special revelation through this vision to tell him he doesn't need to keep the laws anymore if Jesus already taught that? So what many people understand Acts chapter 10 to be, especially if you look at verse 28 there, was that, and it actually says it straight out. It says, God had shown me, Peter writes there, God had shown me through this vision, I should not call any man unholy or unclean. Meaning that was what he was learning. Not that he can eat unclean animals, but the vision was basically showing him that he shouldn't consider any people as unholy or unclean, meaning that even Gentiles could be saved and he could eat with them, meaning that there's no reason why, as long as he was eating kosher food, that he shouldn't be able to have fellowship with Gentile believers in Jesus. So what happens is, according to David Stern, Peter was not someone who gave up eating kosher food. But, and this is where David Stern veers himself from strict Torah observance, what he writes in his commentary is that as far as Peter was concerned, and David Stern believes that as far as the entire movement was concerned, the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, became less important than preserving fellowship between Jewish and Gentile believers in Jesus. And so he says that even though they would normally eat kosher, but if it came to a gathering where there were non-Jewish followers of Jesus that didn't keep kosher, that David Stern believed that they were able to be flexible with the dietary laws, and they could even eat non-kosher food with the Gentiles. And so that's what David Stern believes happened in this chapter in Galatians 2, that initially Paul was flexible in terms of observing the dietary laws when it came to eating with non-Jews. He would even eat food that wasn't totally kosher. But after these people from James came, I guess the more conservative, more Torah observant branch of the movement, he got scared and he basically stopped this flexible position in terms of keeping kosher. Now, I haven't found any of the approaches to this chapter satisfying, except for the way it's understood by Chaim Jacobi. Chaim Jacobi has a really important book about Paul called The Myth Maker, and this is how he understands this story. And I think it's very, very consistent with the rest of Paul's writings. So Jacobi, of course, does not believe that Peter was someone that had stopped observing the dietary laws. Peter was not someone who was eating pork with Gentiles. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a person that's keeping kosher to eat at the same table as someone who's not eating kosher. They just have to be careful not to mix their foods together. So what was going on was this. Peter was originally comfortable eating his kosher food with the non-Jewish, the Gentile believers in Jesus who were not necessarily eating kosher food, but he was comfortable eating with them because Peter assumed that Paul's converts were following the ruling of James in Acts chapter 15, and they were not eating, for example, meat that was strangled or meat that was offered to idols. Right? If you remember, James did not simply give a carte blanche to Gentiles to do whatever they want. He said that they have to maintain the Noahide laws. So if they eat meat that's strangled or if they eat meat that was offered to idols, that's prohibited. They're not allowed to do that. And so according to Chaim Jacobi, what happened in this story here in Galatians chapter 2 is that these representatives of James who have come to Antioch and have told Peter something, what they told Peter was that the converts of Paul, these Gentile converts of Paul, were not abiding by these restrictions. They were not following the Noahide laws. They were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And they were even eating meat that was sacrificed to idols. Now, when we studied together 1 Corinthians, we saw that in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul himself seemed to be very open to the non-Jewish believers in Jesus in Corinth eating meat, eating sacrifices from idols, meaning that this is an area where Paul himself wrote that it was not such a big deal. So obviously, if Paul didn't think it was such a tragedy, Paul's converts, the Gentiles who he was mentoring, they also wouldn't be so careful with this. And when Peter found this out, that he was fellowshipping with Gentiles who were not living up to the rules that were expected of them, and they were actually eating very potentially meat, foods that had been sacrificed to idols, that was something that Paul was not going to abide by. He was not going to sit at the same table with those kind of people. And what really happens here in this chapter, according to Jacobi, I'm not sure this is so clear. I mean, what I shared so far, I think, is very, very clear. What Chaim Jacobi suggests is that this is where Peter essentially demonstrates his break from Paul, meaning this is where Peter and Paul essentially part ways. And even though, the way Paul writes about this story is that Peter later sort of repented of all this, but Jacobi seems to believe that this was really a breaking moment between not just Peter, but between the entire Jerusalem church and Paul. And again, I've mentioned many times in the past that the second century Jewish Christians, the second century Jewish followers of Jesus, were the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. They maintained that Paul was an apostate, that they didn't respect him, they didn't accept him at all. And so this might be the roots of that break, of that split. And, they probably came to realize that Paul was being disingenuous with them, because Paul kept on saying, to the Jew, I become a Jew, right? To those who are under the law, I became as one under the law. And he played a good game, and he always did what he thought would gain him credibility among the Jerusalem group. So when they asked him to sponsor the sacrifices of the people that had been Nazarites, we saw that in the book of Acts chapter 21, I believe it was, he was willing to play along with them because, again, Paul was the one that said, whether in pretense or in truth, I'm able to preach my gospel, then fine, it's all good, and I'll do what it takes. I'll do what it takes. Paul always believed that the ends justify the means. And they probably came to realize that he was really someone who was anti-Torah, not just for Gentiles, but for Jews as well. And that's why James sent these emissaries to expose him. And we saw in the book of Corinthians that he was being followed all the time by people that were basically opposing his teachings. So I think this is the simplest way of understanding this chapter of Galatians 2, that Peter was someone who had not given up the dietary laws, that he was comfortable eating at the same table with Gentile believers in Jesus, until he was informed by these emissaries that came from James that they were not even living up to the simple requirements that were imposed upon them in Acts chapter 15, which is the observance of the Noahide laws. And since Peter was not going to be comfortable eating with people who were themselves eating food that had been sacrificed to idols, that was it as far as Peter was concerned. Now, the rest of the chapter is basically Paul's sermon about salvation comes through faith alone and not through observing the Torah. There's just a few hitches here. So if we go over to verse 16, here in verse 16, Paul says, "Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus the Messiah. So we have also believed in Jesus the Messiah in order to be justified by faith in the Messiah and not by the works of the law. Because by works of the law, by doing the Torah, no one will be justified." Now, one little hiccup in terms of that is what Paul writes back in Romans chapter 2, verse 13. There Paul says, "Not to the hearers of the Torah." I'm sorry, "Not the hearers of the Torah are just before God, but the doers will be justified." So let me just read that again. Paul wrote in Romans, not the hearers, the ones who hear the Torah will be just before God, but the doers will be justified before God. So there he seems to basically say, and that's why, by the way, we know there's a passage later on in the Christian Bible where someone says that Paul is very hard to understand because he's often so contradictory. But in Romans chapter 2, he does give the impression that you could be justified through observing the Torah. But here in Galatians chapter 2, he repeats in this verse we just read, verse 16, 3 times that we are not justified by the Torah at all, only by faith in Jesus. A second hiccup for Paul here is that James, there is an epistle in the Christian Bible called the Epistle of James, a letter of James. And there in chapter 2 in the book of James, verses 21 to 24, he writes that man is not justified by faith alone, meaning that if you wanted to find the one phrase, the slogan of Paul, which became the slogan of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, it's salvation by faith alone. And James straight out says, no, you cannot be justified, you cannot be saved by faith alone. Faith without works, he says, is dead. That you have to also observe the Torah. And this is one of the reasons why Martin Luther wanted to basically omit the book of James from the Christian Bible. He wanted to take it out of the canon because he referred to the book of James as the straw epistle. He thought it was basically garbage because it didn't give, as far as Martin Luther was concerned, a Pauline message at all. Paul's message, again, was salvation through faith alone. And James does not accept that. And just a side question I'm going to ask. I'm not going to really explore this tonight. I'm going to ask it as a rhetorical question. You know, if we have this doctrine here that a person cannot be considered saved, a person cannot be justified in the eyes of God through their observance of the Torah, only through, Paul says, only through faith in Jesus. So how were people justified before Jesus? Meaning in the times of Moses, in the times of the prophet Samuel, in the times of the kings, in the times of the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. During those times, how was a person justified in the eyes of God? If there is this doctrine that it cannot take place, it cannot be through the observance of the Torah, it can only be through faith in Jesus. So it's very difficult to understand how this doctrine can see the possibility of anyone being considered just any time before Jesus. Now, there are only two ways that they can unravel this. Number one is to make the absurd claim that all those people in the Hebrew Bible, they all believed in Jesus. They all somehow looked forward to the coming of Jesus, and they had faith in Jesus, even though Jesus had not come yet, had not died yet. That's often the way some Christian apologists understand this, that people in the Hebrew Bible, what they call the Old Testament, they did have faith in Jesus. It reminds me of how Muslims often will insist that people like Moses was a Muslim. It's reverse engineering and sort of historical revisionism to go back and turn all of the righteous people of the Jewish Bible into Christians. The other way is that they would say, well, the people in the Hebrew Bible were saved through their faith in God, meaning that they had faith in God. And I haven't seen this that often in Christian commentaries, but the problem there is that if it was possible for people in the Hebrew Bible to be considered just in the eyes of God through their faith, simply through their faith in God, as it says, for example, in Genesis chapter 15, that Abraham had faith in God and God considered that as righteousness. So if that's the case, you're able to be considered just in the eyes of God through your faith in God, and that doesn't include Jesus. So then who needs Jesus? Meaning that even after the advent of Jesus, all you need to do is just have faith in God, the same way Isaiah did, the same way Moses did. So that becomes a bit of a problem. And so this whole question of how were people considered just before Jesus is, I think, a bit of a problem. But again, we're not going to spend more time on that tonight. I want to try to finish up the chapter within the hour, hopefully. But David Stern has, I think, an interesting take on this whole claim that Paul makes. So when Paul says that, for example, I'm dead to the law, or you're no longer under the law, the law cannot save you. The law cannot do it. I mean, Paul is constantly negating the law. What David Stern insists is that it really should not be translated as the law, but he says it should be read as legalism, meaning David Stern wants to preserve the importance of the Torah. He's a Messianic Jew. He doesn't want to take the Torah and flush it down the toilet. So which many Protestants are comfortable doing. So David Stern says it's not that Paul is attacking the law per se. He's not critiquing the Torah. Paul is critiquing legalism. And the way David Stern defines legalism is, he says it's the idea of following a set of rules mechanically without having faith, without trusting in God, without love for God or love of man, etc. That's how David Stern characterizes legalism. And he says that's what Paul is negating. Of course, this kind of legalism was already denounced in the Torah and in rabbinic writings. We didn't need Paul to come around and knock this kind of legalism. What we find in the Torah and in all the rabbinic writings that preceded Paul was the absolute need for faith in God, for trust in God, for love of God. And these ideas are constantly emphasized in the Torah and in the rabbinic writings. Faithful Jews have always lived like this, meaning faithful Jews were never people who simply mechanically did the commandments without faith in God, without trust in God, without loving God. They went hand in glove. And so the idea of legalism is a monstrous distortion of Judaism, and it was never something that was engaged by faithful Jews. And so for faithful Jews, there was always a loyalty and adherence to the Torah laws. There was a Torah observance, mitzvah observance, plus what is referred to as the chovot halavavos, the duties of the mind, meaning faith and trust and love. Those were always embraced by all faithful Jews. What's interesting is that Paul's approach, even according to David Stern, right? Paul is saying that no, there's nothing wrong with the law. There's nothing wrong with the Torah. Actually, the Torah is wonderful. And it would be good to observe the Torah. Just, right, don't assume that the Torah is what is going to save you. And don't do it mechanically. It can't be observed mechanically. Can't be observed without faith and trust. But we see that historically, Paul's teachings led to the abandonment of Torah observance among his followers, meaning that we see that it didn't take long for all of Paul's followers, both Jews and Gentiles, to totally negate the observance of the Torah. Now, the last thing I wanted to focus on for tonight, for this chapter, is verse 21. I always felt that verse 21 in this chapter, the last verse, is probably the most significant verse in the Christian Bible. Paul writes, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the Torah, then the Messiah died for no purpose. Then Christ died in vain. That's what Paul says. He says, if you could be righteous through the Torah, through observing the Torah, then he says that the Messiah died for no purpose. He died in vain. Look, we know from the book of Psalms, chapter 19, verses 8 to 12, that the Torah is perfect and it has the ability to restore our souls. And so when we look at the way King David writes about the Torah, he writes that the Torah is able to transform us and to restore our souls. And if we look carefully at the life of David, I'm just giving one example. I can give many examples in the Tanakh. But if you look at the book of Psalms in chapter 18, verses 21 to 25, I think in the Christian Bible it would be verses 20 to 24. It's a very, very important passage to pay attention to. Let me just get it up in my Bible here. This is what David says. God is rewarding me for the righteousness. God is rewarding me for my righteousness and for having hands clean of sin, meaning that he says, why does God reward me? Because I'm righteous and I don't sin. He says, following God's ways, I don't do wrong. I am mindful of his laws always, and I am honestly aware of my temptation. So God repays me according to my innocence. Meaning that when you read this chapter in Psalms, chapter 18, David writes about the fact that why was he someone that was considered righteous? He was considered righteous because he was someone who was Torah observant. He observed the Torah. And if you look at 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 8, that's basically what we're told, that David was someone who was considered to be righteous by God because he observed the Torah. And in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 5, the same exact assessment of King David, that King David was someone who basically was considered righteous by God because he observed the Torah. Another personality, if you look at 2 Kings chapter 23, let me just get this in my Torah here. 2 Kings chapter 23 speaks about King Josiah. Again, one of the righteous kings. So how does the Bible assess King Josiah? So we're told in verse 25, before him there had never been a king like him who returned to God with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his resources, in accordance with the entire law of Moses, with the entire Torah of Moses. And after him, no one arose like him. So we're told that King Josiah was someone who observed all the laws of the Torah, and therefore he was someone who was with God with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his resources. It wasn't just a mechanical observance of the Torah. He was considered righteous as a righteous king specifically because he both observed the laws of the Torah with his body and with his soul, with his heart, and with his mind. And we see that in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verses 1 to 2, Josiah was compared to his ancestor, King David. So these are personalities in the Torah where we see basically the error of Paul's ways, that Paul is saying that you cannot be considered righteous because you observe the Torah. And what the Bible itself says is no, that you can be considered righteous through observing the Torah. Again, you have to observe the Torah not just mechanically, but with your heart and with your soul and with all your mind. And what's critical is not only what the Bible says. What's important to pay attention to is not what the Scripture says, but what the Scripture doesn't say. Meaning that when you go through the Tanakh, you will find that it always emphasizes the vital importance of observing the commandments, of observing the law. The Tanakh is constantly emphasizing the importance of the commandments, the benefit of observing the commandments, the value of observing the commandments, meaning that all a person needs to do is just tabulate what does the Tanakh, what do the Hebrew Scriptures say about the mitzvot, about the commandments. It says that they are eternally obligatory. We're required to observe them forever. And it speaks about the idea that God specifically made his covenant with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments, that the Tanakh teaches that God chose the Jewish people on the basis of their observance of the commandments of the Torah. The commandments of the Torah are so important that even though Jewish people never fully observed them throughout their history, meaning that Jews have always slipped up and made mistakes. But we're told that in the Messianic age, because the commandments are so important, we're told that in the Messianic age, the Jewish people will all be fully observant of the Torah. It's one of the things that's going to happen with the new covenant that's made, the renewed covenant, that God will place our Torah, we're told, in our hearts. And when the Torah is in our hearts, we're told, we will be faithful to observe it. And the Torah emphasizes the beauty of the commandments, the value of the commandments, the importance of the commandments. But one thing that the scriptures never say is that the mitzvot, the law, the commandments, cannot contribute to being righteous. Meaning the one thing that Paul insists on over and over and over again, that the observance of the Torah cannot contribute to you being considered righteous. It's only faith in the Messiah. This is a concept that is never spoken about in the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible never speaks about the importance of believing in the Messiah. The Jewish Bible never speaks about the weakness of the commandments. The Jewish Bible never tells us the message of Paul. And so it's, again, very important to pay attention not just to what the scriptures say, but to think about what the scriptures don't say. And that's all she wrote for Galatians chapter 2.
All right. Well, it's certainly enough. That's for sure. Oh, wow. Right when you think you got a good dose of it, you feel like you're hitting the tip of the iceberg. But that's good. That's what it's all about. So a good learning curve for everybody. Rabbi, thank you for your time.
Listen.
Yes, sir.
The next time we do Galatians chapter 2, because we're not just going to do the New Testament once together. We're going to go back and do it again one day.
Got it.
So next time we do it, we'll do it even on a deeper level.
Okay, cool. So what you're saying is this really is just the tip of the iceberg.
That's right. That's right.
All right, very good. Rabbi, you have a great week. Shavuot Tov, and you guys, we'll see you next time, same place, Hashem willing. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye.